For a little bit of backstory, I go to a school with around 2,000 people, and this happened during my junior year of high school, and I'm a senior now. This might not be one of the more extreme incidents that most people experience with a stalker, but it's still one that terrifies me even a year later. For reference, I'm a female and was around 17 at the time this happened. As stated before, I was a junior in high school and I was definitely no popular kid. I was that one typical introvert you'd see walking around school minding her own business. I'd like to point out that I have autism, so it was exceedingly difficult for me to connect with people. There used to be a student in my 5th period class that I sat 2 seats away from in the back of the room who always kept to himself. His name was Ryan, who was also a junior who had some serious issues. He started cutting himself in class when the teacher wasn't looking and had even threatened to stab people, including me. I didn't tell the teacher or my parents about it due to my overwhelming anxiety and thought that I'd be the one to get into trouble if I did. He would have several outbursts in front of the class and would sometimes leave the room at any point. The school pretty much knew about Ryan, and he ended up being sent to the YOC for about a month and never came back. For those of you who don't know what the YOC is, it's basically a mental institution for troubled youth. Sort of like a mental hospital for minors. A few months had passed and I had forgotten all about Ryan until one day where I got some chilling news. I was in my 3rd period and we were going over our research papers when there was a knock at the door. The teacher goes to open the door, and standing there is the principal along with a school resource officer. The SOR told my teacher that they needed me immediately. At this point, I'm shaking and have no clue what was going on, and I pack my bag and the SRO escorts me out of the classroom. I walk with them to the main office and they sit me down in a private room where my parents and a police officer were waiting. The SRO officer tells me to listen carefully and to answer all given questions honestly. I nervously agree, and right away they begin to ask me about Ryan. I became petrified as he said this, and I said that I didn't know much about him other than he may have been suicidal. The conversation went as follows. How long have you known him for? Maybe a few months at the most. I barely even talked to him. He had mentioned your name earlier when we found him. My name? Why? Where did you find him? He's been missing for weeks and your parents ended up finding him in your house. My blood ran cold and that's when I could tell my parents looked visibly scared. I tell them that I have no idea how he figured out my address and that I've only ever spoken to him once, which was for a group project. Turns out, Ryan had been stalking my house for weeks as well as other students' homes for no apparent reason. I go back to class and as I step inside, I immediately get bombarded with questions about what happened. Completely shook and utterly terrified, I ignore them and finish the day. My parents ended up pulling me out of school for a week and I ended up having to get therapy after what had happened. Needless to say, I didn't end up talking to anyone for the rest of the school year, but I still cower at the sound of his name.
As an 18-year-old male, I never in my life thought I'd have any association with a stalker. In the media, stalker stories are always portrayed as some creepy bottom feeder becoming obsessed with a sweet but clueless girl and slowly invading every aspect of her privacy. My encounter with a stalker was far different. It occurred during the first time I was ever on my own. I'm originally from the East Coast, but I'm currently a freshman attending college in Los Angeles. Due to COVID, the dorms were closed and classes virtual, but I ended up coming to LA anyway, getting an apartment close to campus. I was really excited to move across the country and live on my own in a new city and get a taste of adulthood for a year. I wasn't completely alone though. I had friends from the past who had also ended up in LA. My friend Tommy was a close friend that I had made at camp years ago, who attended another college in LA. My other friend Felix was incidentally also from the same camp, and back in the day, the three of us had been very close. Felix had decided to take the year off and make music with his friends in LA. My apartment building was only about 8 buildings down from Felix's. However, with my packed weeks and free weekends, our schedules were nearly the opposite, with his weekends busy with work and his relative freedom during the week. As a result, I ended up growing particularly close to Tommy, and we'd alternate who went there due to the 20-mile Uber ride between us. Oftentimes, Tommy and I would hang out with Felix and his other friends whenever Tommy came to my area of the city. My apartment was about a 5-minute walk from a downtown area with restaurants, grocery stores, coffee shops, and boutiques. When I first moved in the fall, I took advantage of the pleasant nights, in contrast to my home's often harsh climate, by taking long walks at night through the well-lit and populated streets to explore and get familiar with my new neighborhood. LA is a beautiful city with a dynamic culture and unbeatable weather, but it does have the constant and often harsh reminder of homelessness, many of whom have mental illnesses and have otherwise been discarded by society. I had grown to despise the indifference that's shown toward them by people on the street who avoid their eyes at all costs, as if their life depended on it. In particular, during my first week, I was crossing a major boulevard when I noticed a man who appeared to be homeless in a wheelchair with one of his wheels caught in a deep pothole. He wasn't making any noise, but he was flailing frantically. I was far behind him and couldn't believe people were just walking past him, looking down at their phones. I wasn't even going to make it to the other side in accordance with crossing time myself, but I expected surely someone around me would help him. But people still passed by without even acknowledging him. I was so frustrated, I ended up yelling to the people ahead of me in the crosswalk and got a middle finger back. I asked him if he needed help, and he still didn't talk, but he nodded. He was crumpled into what seemed like a wrinkled but finely made tuxedo jacket. I could only see his frizzy blackish gray hair thrashing in the clothes. I got his wheel out of the pothole and quickly wheeled him across the street. As I got him onto the sidewalk, he abruptly turned to me, exposing his face to me, only inches away from mine. I pulled away because he was way too close to me in the middle of a pandemic, and also because of his startling face. He was tan, a dark, worn tan with deep sun wrinkles, like you'd imagine on old people at a Florida beach, forming what looked like a mask. His eyes were sunken deeply into his head and completely dead. I mean, completely vacant. I didn't even feel like he was looking at me, but through me. "Get away," he growled in a voice that was so raspy, it didn't even sound human. I scoffed at the man and continued walking, assuming that would be the last time I'd ever see him. Especially in a city of 4 million people, and considering I pass hundreds of strangers a day that I'll never see again. I continue on with my life for some time and had forgotten about him entirely, but unfortunately, that didn't last long. To walk to the grocery store, I have to pass through an area with a great amount of foot traffic. In this area, one afternoon, I spotted a man in front of me that was soon to pass me, walking oddly. It wasn't exactly a limp. It was almost like he was drunk. It wasn't until closer that I recognized his blank eyes and frizzy hair. There was no wheelchair in sight. There was something about the man that raised major red flags in me. Maybe it was the vacancy of his eyes or just some judgmental gut instinct that told me to get away. I tried to reserve as much judgment as I could because I figured he likely had some sort of mental illness. I was hoping to pass him quickly without acknowledgement, but when I got beside him, he stopped walking, causing me to momentarily pause. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I smiled at him and quickly kept walking. After that incident, I saw him many more times, and every time he'd turn to my direction. I learned to ignore it and barely registered it. Eventually, he went away for a while, and I foolishly thought that was the last of him. Months after I had stopped seeing him, Tommy was supposed to come over to my apartment. We were supposed to pick up alcohol for all of us before going over to Felix and his friend's apartment to hang out. As we were about to enter the liquor store, I could see the tall man with the tuxedo jacket standing at the intersection several feet past the store. I was somewhat disappointed that he had come back, but it wasn't the end of the world, especially because I was with Tommy and had learned to ignore him. I didn't even bother explaining the situation to Tommy, though. Anyway, we had just checked out and left the store, taking a left to a nearby intersection away from the one I originally spotted him at. And guess who was standing at the crosswalk? My heart sank, knowing it would only be the three of us waiting for the crossing sign to change. Tommy was talking to me, completely naive to the situation, but I could see the man beside him turn to us. Tommy saw my face change and turned to the man. He quickly turned back to me, giving me a look upon seeing the man's face. The sign finally changed and we walked quickly across the street. Tommy continued talking to me, but at that point I was rattled. Up until then, I had never had such direct, prolonged contact with the man. "Are you good?" Tommy asked. I explained to him that I was seeing that man everywhere, all across my area of the city, and that every time I'd see him, he'd just stare at me. Tommy didn't really take me seriously and clowned me for being so worried. We got to Felix's house and Tommy soon forgot about the incident while we were hanging out, but I didn't. We all got fairly drunk, but I couldn't shake this nagging sense of dread. Eventually, around 2 a.m., Tommy had taken an Uber back to his apartment and many of the guys were going to bed. Honestly, I was still quite buzzed and irrationally afraid to walk that late at night, unlike the dozens of other nights that I've done the exact same. I was comforted by reminding myself that I'd only seen him in the commercial area, not the residential blocks around it, where we were. There were 2 cross streets between our buildings, and the walk usually takes about 2 minutes, and that night I was particularly paranoid and hurried. The streets were nearly empty, being that deep into the night and all. I passed one of the crossroads, but as I got closer to the next one, I saw a figure sitting on the curb of the intersection diagonal from the one I was about to reach. My heart started pounding, but I assured myself it could just be a drunk college student. As I got closer, I could see the white streaks in the man's hair. You know those moments when you see something so shocking and you get momentary tunnel vision? It was exactly that, and combined with my drunkenness, I almost fell over once I realized who it was. I turned around and wondered if I should run back to Felix's apartment. The man's head rose from his lap, glaring at me with his empty eyes. That moment is one of the only moments in my life that I felt genuinely in danger. I got to the intersection hesitantly, pausing at the sidewalk opening to the intersection. I expected him to stand, but he didn't. He stayed sitting on the curb, seemingly waiting for my decision. I looked down across the street and wondered if I should walk around the block so he wouldn't know where I lived, but part of me wanted to sprint to my building 200 feet ahead of me. My apartment building was large enough that he'd never know my apartment, but still the thought of him knowing my address was unsettling. I was running through the choices in my head when I thankfully heard two guys approach the intersection from the opposite end of the crossroad, right in the path of the man on the curb. They were both drunk, but when they saw him, they looked at him and both looked at each other, then at me, frozen. "There you guys are," I yelled at them, beckoning them down the crossroad. They picked it up almost immediately, then yelled "Hey back," quickly passing him. As we walked down from the intersection, one of them asked if I was okay. I explained to them what was going on, knowing they wouldn't remember in the morning. After a continuous flow of, "Bro," we had reached the street parallel to mine. They reached their building and said goodbye to me, and I was alone again. It had to have been 3 by that point, and I was exhausted. I decided to sprint home to my building from the other direction where he was, so I could quickly slip into the building without seeing whether he was still there. When I got to the door, I couldn't help myself and looked at the intersection as I unlocked the door, and he was gone. I quickly opened the door and closed it behind me. I pressed the elevator call button, anxiously watching outside the door through the glass wall. I didn't feel safe until I got back onto the elevator, after which I let out the biggest sigh of relief. I never told my parents this story. They were already so nervous about me living on my own so far away that they'd lose their minds and likely would have made me come home if I had told them. After that fiasco, I stayed in my apartment for a few days, working from there instead of going out into public. A few days in, I realized I was being ridiculous and left to get a coffee in town. Luckily, he wasn't there. For weeks, I continued to walk through the commercial area without any sight of the man. Weeks turned to months, which turned to academic terms. I'd gone home during the winter for winter break, and when I came back, I'd still yet to see him again. After enough time, I assumed he was gone. Maybe he had just been trying to scare me, and he was satisfied after doing so that night, so he was on to another victim. Once again, I made this stupid, naive assumption that he was gone. By that time, it was late into the spring term, and people had started to go back to their homes all over the country. A couple weeks before I left LA, Tommy and I were hanging out one last time the night before he was flying home. I'd grown to appreciate Tommy's apartment. It was one of the only places I felt entirely safe, due to it being so far from my neighborhood of the city. I had previously told Tommy about the events that occurred that night, and he finally believed me after that. The night of the final incident, I was over at his apartment, and the night was as normal as could be. Late into the night, Tommy and I had decided to take a walk to a 24-hour donut shop a couple blocks north of his building. We got to the shop pretty quickly and ordered our donuts. We were the only ones in the shop except for the 2 other employees, so we were served almost immediately. As we left the shop, Tommy turned around and now it was his face that dropped. Tommy was the kind of person that, when he has a look of dread, you better take it seriously. I turned around in response and felt like I was going to faint. Standing under the dim light of the donut shop was the man. In the same dirty flip-flops, tank top, torn pants pulled up to his chest, and tuxedo jacket I'd come to associate with him. He stood there, staring at us. Not us. Me. This time, his eyes weren't empty. They were focused on mine like a laser, and I could see the fury behind them. Tommy and I were silent for a second, both of us frozen. I looked at Tommy and mouthed to run. In that second, the two of us sprinted back to his apartment at our fastest possible speed. Tommy never looked back, but when he was flashing his card to get past the locked door, I could see the man's uneven gait walking down the sidewalk towards us. The door unlocked and we ran into the lobby, slamming the automatically locking door behind us. We sprinted up the stairs to his floor where we caught our breath in the hallway. Tommy had a look of disbelief in his eyes, and I was shaking with adrenaline. To this day, I have absolutely no clue how the man could have gotten 20 miles and known exactly where we were. It must have required such deep surveillance. I felt like I was going to puke thinking about it. Tommy was rattled and gladly left Los Angeles the following day. I was there for another week, but I was so busy with finals and packing that I didn't leave my apartment. I don't think I'll ever know what that man wanted from me or why he harassed me for months. By no means is this supposed to deter people from helping the less fortunate, but in rare instances, good deeds can come at unknowingly dark costs. I'd like to be noble and say I don't regret helping him, but honestly I do. When I come back to Los Angeles in the fall, I'll be in the dorms, as will Tommy. Somehow, that man was able to follow me 20 miles, so what's to say he won't also find me in the dorms, only a few hundred feet from my old apartment? I can't call the police. What would I say? The man hadn't technically done anything wrong, and furthermore, LA was filled with vagrants, far out of the light of the police. I won't tell my parents because they'll kill me knowing I kept it from them the whole year. I can only wonder what'll happen this fall, and I guess only time will tell.
This story is told in the perspective of a female. I apologize if the length of my story is a bit short, but I'm only going to get right to the point of what caused all this. This happened when I was 18 years old in my first semester of college. I was living in a dorm with my roommate, who was also my best friend at the time. We've known each other since middle school and had connected great ever since then. 3 rooms down from me lived another student who didn't have a roommate and always kept to himself. Once in a while, I'd walk past him and wave, but all he would do is stare directly through my soul. It was weird at first, but I just dismissed it as poor communication skills and thought nothing of it. But as time progressed, his demeanor would completely change and his level of creepiness would only get worse. He would look at me with a creepy smile and sometimes even wait for me by my dorm when I got out of class. It got to the point where I felt extremely uncomfortable and started ignoring him. He would try to get my attention a few more times before he finally got the hint to leave me alone. This worked for about a few weeks before something happened where he had finally crossed the line. I was coming back from my physics class, and once I opened the door to my room, I saw him on my bed holding my roommate's underwear. I screamed at him to get out, which then got the attention of campus security to escort him off campus. He was suspended for 2 weeks, but I never saw him again after that, which hopefully meant that he never returned.